Here in the U.S., Renita, legal marijuana is also becoming the norm. And the question now is whether it leads to any changes for people who are serving time for past marijuana crimes. In this week's edition of Bloomberg Equality on Bloomberg Television, I spoke with Sarah Gersten. She's managing director and legal counsel for the Last Prisoner Project.
One thing that we have absolutely seen, particularly from more recent states that have legalized, is a really broad expansion of expungement provisions or clean slate initiatives tied to cannabis legalization. So what that means is for individuals that have already served their sentence but are still suffering from having a cannabis conviction on their criminal records, we're seeing a lot of states implement really broad legislation or initiatives to provide relief to clear those offenses. What we have not seen really widespread progress on is retroactive relief for those still serving active cannabis sentences, even in states that have fully legalized cannabis.
Okay, and Sarah, you've estimated there are around 40,000 cannabis prisoners in the U.S., but this is pretty much a rough number. Why is it so difficult to determine just how many actual cannabis prisoners there are?
This is a very difficult number to ascertain for several reasons. The first is that, of course, in the U.S., we're dealing with a complex intersection of various systems. So we have prisoners that are incarcerated on the federal level, we have individuals incarcerated on the state level, and then we have people in short-term incarceration in jails, in detention centers that are under different regulatory authorities at the county or municipal level. And each of those different systems have various ways that they account for incarcerated individuals. Some actually do provide information as to which drug offenders are incarcerated for which type of substance, but many of those systems don't actually categorize offenders based on the type of drug that they're serving a drug offense for.
Sarah, you've been working on getting compassionate release for prisoners who are sentenced for nonviolent marijuana offenses. How has COVID changed or accelerated that effort?
COVID has really accelerated this effort across the board for anyone that's currently incarcerated federally in the U.S. When COVID started really ravaging our correctional systems, the Bureau of Prisons, actually under the 2018 First Step Act, had modified the way that incarcerated individuals could apply for compassionate release through the sentencing court. But one of the biggest issues that someone needs to raise in one of these filings is basically a medical necessity or health reason for deserving compassionate release. Well, COVID presents a really urgent health risk for anyone that's currently incarcerated, but particularly for those with comorbidities or who might be part of the aging population, which is an increasing number of our federal prisoners. So we have absolutely seen a much broader use of this type of mechanism for release, but we've also seen many more success stories of judges granting compassionate release post-COVID.
Right. Interesting how that accelerated the effort. Now, one thing we haven't talked about, and one thing I've read about, is this idea that resentencing and expungement laws are petition-based. What does that mean in practice?
So in many of the states that have provided for some type of retroactive relief measure, whether that be resentencing or expungement, these initiatives are petition-based, meaning that the individual seeking the relief has to proactively apply to the regulatory authority for that relief. And what we find in states that have pursued a petition-based process is that there's an uptake gap. What that means is that we have this phenomenon where, on average, only about 6 to 10% of eligible individuals across the country that are actually taking advantage of these types of processes. And of course, you can understand when, first of all, someone has to know that they are eligible for this type of relief. Second, they have to navigate what is oftentimes a complex legal process to actually initiate those types of petitions. So what we are seeking in every state that is legalizing is actually automatic provisions for expungement and resentencing, which puts the burden on the state or the correction system to identify those individuals and provide that relief.
Now, Sarah, one thing that comes up a lot is the economic argument for legalizing cannabis. New job growth, for instance, increased tax revenues. Cannabis companies themselves, of course, helped support the ballot measures. There's also an economic argument for releasing prisoners. You reduce the cost of mass incarceration. Is there anyone or anything that's actually actively funding this last policy measure?
So many of our partners that fund the work that we do come from the cannabis industry. And I think that shows you that beyond the economic incentives for these companies, they understand that criminal justice reform, racial justice reform has to be part and parcel of any kind of legalization initiative. But to your point, where we see huge support for these types of initiatives from within the systems or from within states or counties are those that are actually seeking ways to address huge budget deficits amidst COVID, and they see a reduction in their prison population or their jail population as a huge way to do that.
And that was Sarah Gersten of the Last Prisoner Project, a nonprofit dedicated to bring restorative justice to those who have suffered under cannabis criminalization. The group estimates more than 15.5 million people have been arrested for marijuana offenses in the last decade.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.